in the big picture, one of the most important functions in the body, really, one of the key functions in the body is the maintenance of serum or plasma glucose. Okay? You don't want it to go too high, you don't want it to go too low. Hyperglycemia or hypoglycemia. Okay, so maintenance of blood glucose in the body drives a lot of processes. And we just talked about hormones, signal transduction, receptors. That's how blood glucose is maintained, through the action of specific hormones. Okay? So I want you to kind of connect the dots here. We don't just... Hormones are going to regulate many of the processes that contribute to the maintenance of blood glucose level. That glucose level in the blood is, you don't need to memorize it, but roughly it should be somewhere between 80 and 100 milligrams per deciliter. That's the normal sort of concentration. So there are 4 distinct metabolic processes that either use up glucose or produce glucose. Okay? And I want you to really appreciate what that means and kind of appreciate that there's basically a constant regulation or balance between all these 4 processes. Okay? So I'm going to start with 2 processes that use glucose. Okay? So here's glucose in the blood. It goes into the tissues. One of the ways you can use glucose when there's plenty of it is to store it. And where do you store it? You store it in 2 distinct organs: liver and muscle. How do you store it? You store it as a large polysaccharide called glycogen. So hence, one use of blood glucose is to store it for later use in the form of glycogen. So that process consumes glucose. That's very important, the term consumes. It uses up glucose by storing it in the form of glycogen. Another process, which we'll talk about later today, that also consumes glucose is glycolysis. And glycolysis consumes glucose by breaking it down into a smaller molecule known as pyruvate. Okay? In doing so, it provides the cell with energy. So that's one of the first things I want you to think about when we talk about glycolysis or any other pathway. But for glycolysis, you want to ask yourself that first important question. What is glycolysis for? You should be able to answer it. You should be able to say glycolysis is for getting energy out of glucose. And most tissues need that energy from glucose. Okay? So here we have 2 important pathways that both consume glucose. In a way, it should be kind of intuitive to say, okay, when do you think the body will consume glucose? usually when you have plenty of glucose in the bloodstream, right? So when does that happen? That happens typically after a meal, within 4 hours after a meal. So this is the first thing I want you to think about, that the consumption of glucose, either by glycogenesis, which is glycogen synthesis, the same as glycogen synthesis, or glycolysis, will occur in a well-fed state. That means your blood glucose is relatively high, or close to the high, near 100, 120 milligrams per, or a little more. Okay, so so that's when these glucose-consuming processes will occur. There are two other processes involving glucose. Those are, as the subtitle shows, those processes, the function is to restore blood glucose. Restore it as it's dropping back to the normal level. And how do you restore blood glucose? Obviously, you restore blood glucose by producing glucose. So the body switches, if you want, tissues, specific tissues, switch function in a way and start to produce glucose. How do you produce glucose? By breaking down whatever glycogen was stored in the first place. If you break down glycogen, you produce glucose, you release it into the bloodstream, it restores the blood level of glucose in the bloodstream. Glycogenolysis, or glycogen degradation. Again, that's a glucose-producing pathway. A fourth, or a second glucose-producing pathway is something called gluconeogenesis. And that simply means the synthesis of glucose, de novo synthesis of glucose from smaller precursors, smaller molecules, making a new molecule of glucose. So one source of glucose is breakdown of glycogen. The other one is by de novo, or new glucose synthesis from smaller molecules. Both of these will contribute to restoring blood glucose to its normal levels. Okay? So you intuitively, again, should think, okay, when do we need this? When does the body need to produce glucose? Typically, when you're in a fasting state. And fasting simply means about 5 hours without a meal. Okay, so this is important in the big picture. I remember actually when a student a long time ago, and I think it's a good, came up to me and say, you know, Dr. G, the gluconeogenesis doesn't happen all the time. I said, you sure? And he said, yeah, it seems like. I said, well, think about when you go to sleep. Doesn't your body need some energy? Doesn't your brain need to function? Don't your muscles need to maintain some tone? Actually, these two processes occur all the time, especially when you are without a meal for a while, for a few hours, and during sleep. Okay? So as you can see, there's a balance between glucose consumption, which usually occurs in a well-fed state, and glucose production, which occurs in a fasting state. Okay? All right, so it's very important that you get the big picture. So we're going to start with the first glucose-consuming pathway. And again, I'm going to actually say this may be a good way, a good place to tell you how to organize the pathway. You want to ask about 5 questions. Okay? The first question is going to be, what is that pathway for? We just answered it. Glycolysis is to get energy, breaking down glucose, get energy out of glucose for most cells. Second thing you want to ask is, where does it occur? And the where is a 2-part question. What tissues and what part of the cell? Okay? I'll answer these as we go. What tissues? All tissues have glycolysis. What part of the cell? Glycolysis occurs entirely in the cytoplasm. So you got to know that. Third question you want to ask is, what is the energy input and output from glycolysis? Do you consume energy in glycolysis and then you're going to produce energy? So what's your net output in energy? That's very important. That's item number 3. Item number 4 is the most important one in terms of the amount of effort it needs. You want to know some of the key enzymes which we call rate-limiting enzymes. For example, glycolysis will have 3 of them. So you want to know how these enzymes work and how they are regulated. And there will be multiple ways to regulate each and every one. So that's where the details come in, and that's where your most effort goes into for most pathways. Item number 4. Item number 5 is going to be, are there important clinical correlates? Is there an inherited vitamin, is there an inherited enzyme deficiency? Is there a specific vitamin requirement or something of that nature? So those are clinically relevant facts. Okay? So I'll remind you of these as we go through glycolysis, but I want you to really try to do that for glycolysis, and you'll find that it makes it a lot easier to keep things together for each and every pathway. Okay, so glucose is in the bloodstream. Before anything happens to it, you have to bring it into the cell, into the cytoplasm, from the bloodstream. And this green structure here is a protein in the membrane specifically designed to transport glucose. So glucose comes in on one side, on the extracellular side, and this transport protein allows it then to go across the membrane into the cytoplasm. Before this happens, the cells have no access to that glucose. So you should appreciate how important the transport of glucose is. Okay? There are 7 glucose transporters, distinct glucose transporters with different tissue distribution. And we're going to talk about them. They're abbreviated as GLUT1 through 7, and another one with a different designation. And their function is to bring in glucose from the bloodstream. Okay? So that's what we're going to do first. And this looks a little scary at first, but I just want to point out to you, pay attention to just some of the features I'll say about each one. So the first transporter is called GLUT1. It's usually in most tissues. Okay? And its high affinity means it can bring in glucose even when glucose is kind of low in the bloodstream. And it brings in glucose and galactose, not fructose. But the key one is that it's in most tissues. So that's an important feature about GLUT1. GLUT2 is extremely important. Very important transporter, mainly because of two things. It's exclusively found in the liver and pancreas, mainly the liver, really, of the important part. And this transporter is unique in that it's bidirectional. It can transport the glucose into the cell or from the liver cells, from the hepatocytes into the bloodstream. Okay? So that's GLUT2. What you want to know is tissue distribution and that it is bidirectional. GLUT3 is in many ways similar to GLUT1. Also, it's more restricted primarily in neuronal tissues, the placenta and testes. So then we get to GLUT4. GLUT4 is another very important transporter. And this one is exclusively found in muscle, both skeletal and cardiac muscle, as well as adipose tissue. This transporter is unique to these tissues, and its importance is that it is insulin dependent. How much transporter is present in these tissues depends on the presence of insulin. Just as a big general thing, insulin promotes the increase of the number of GLUT4 transporters in these tissues. So these tissues then are able to pick up more glucose from the bloodstream. Okay? So that's a very important transporter. As a matter of fact, it's a target for therapies for diabetes. That's how important it is. Okay? One of the targets. GLUT5 is another sort of widely distributed transporter. It mainly transports fructose and is present in many tissues. GLUT7, all of these, by the way, 1 through 5, are all part of the cell membrane. That's where the transporters should be, right? Because they're going to bring in the glucose from the bloodstream. GLUT7 is unique in that it is intracellular. It's inside the cell. It's part of the ER membrane, endoplasmic reticulum. It's exclusively found in hepatocytes, and it serves a function. It serves a function in that when the liver is producing glucose, it produces it inside the ER, and that glucose has to be transported out of the ER into the cytoplasm. So that's the importance of GLUT7. It's present in the ER of the liver. And the last one here, the symporter of sodium and glucose, or galactose, is part of primarily of the intestinal epithelia and of the small intestine and kidney tubules, and that's important in the absorption of glucose from the diet. So the importance of this, it transports both glucose and sodium in the same direction. So just remember the key features, where they are, especially GLUT7, GLUT4, GLUT2. All of them are important, but really those three are especially important. Okay. If you like this channel, please subscribe. Thank you.